The canal in the middle of this picture is the dividing line between two residential areas, two different zip codes. The canal is actually a creek, and the street next to the creek is Alter Road. From a bird's eye view, it's obvious that the area on the left is very green indeed. By comparison, the other area consists of smaller lots and more densely built single-family homes. Contrary to what you might expect, based on the greenness, the zip code on the left belongs to a poor neighborhood, while the area on the right is extremely wealthy. The median home price in that area is approaching $500,000, compared to less than 100 grand in the other zip code. Differences in child poverty are even more dramatic. A staggering 40% on the left, compared to only 2% in the wealthy zip code. What's going on? Is the area on the left in the countryside? Perhaps what we're dealing with is rural poverty. Definitely not. The poor zip code is located in southeastern corner of Detroit, Michigan. And the piece of land we've been looking at fits inside that yellow square. The border in question is between Grosse Pointe Park and Detroit. Why don't we land on the ground to see what this area looks like at the street level? So that's what Grosse Pointe Park looks like. Pretty comfortable, eh? What about Detroit? It's a big city. Why is it so green? As you can see, Detroit has a lot of green space because large areas of the city are littered with vacant lots. In some neighborhoods, there are entire city blocks missing. How did this happen? What happened to all those homes? Let's ask Dr. Reynolds Farley, Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan. Dr. Farley has dedicated his very long and successful career to describing and explaining this very phenomenon. So, Dr. Farley, you're an expert on Detroit. You're an expert on issues like residential segregation in the United States, but particularly you're famous for your understanding of the city of Detroit. Can you explain why this area of Detroit looks like that?
Detroit was, for a long period of time, the fourth largest city in the United States. And in the 1950 census, there were almost 2 million residents of the city of Detroit. But 70 years later, in the 2020 census, there were only about 620,000 people in the city of Detroit. So Detroit lost virtually 2/3 of its population. People moved to the suburbs. The city didn't have much money to stabilize neighborhoods or to invest in neighborhoods. Many of those homes were abandoned, so they let the homes continue to deteriorate. There was virtually no outmigration of African Americans from the city of Detroit until about 1990. But since 1990, the affluent African American population has moved out of Detroit in substantial numbers. I think the reason for that is the perception that crime rates are lower in the suburbs and the schools are definitely better in the suburbs.
I have an anecdote that speaks directly to what you were just saying. And I had a layover in Detroit, and as we were leaving the plane, I just overheard this conversation between the folks sitting in front of me. There was a white man talking to this professional black woman and asking idly, as you would ask a fellow passenger, asking, "Is this your home destination? Are you changing flights here?" And she said, "No, this is it for me, end of the road for me." And he said, "Oh, so you live in Detroit?" And she looked at this man and said,
"Nobody lives in Detroit."
Even the suggestion, apparently, that she might live in Detroit was a little bit offensive because, as she said, nobody lives in Detroit.
Detroit has, to some degree, turned a corner, and thank goodness it looks like employment is growing in Detroit in the healthcare sector and in the financial services sector, and that's beneficial to Detroit and to the state of Michigan. According to the Census Bureau, in the last decade, Detroit has been losing about 2,000 residents a year, and the mayor is quite convinced if the data were really accurate, the loss would be virtually zero. But there has been a very substantial change, and yet there are the lingering effects of this vast depopulation of Detroit.
The old house is still standing, though the paint is cracked and dry. And there's that old oak tree that I used to play on. Down the lane I walk with my sweet Mary, hair of gold and lips like cherries. It's good to touch the green, green grass of home. Yes, they'll all come to see me, arms reaching, smiling sweetly. It's good to touch the green, green grass of home.